Star Wars is one of the biggest franchises in the history of cinema. The game franchise based before the films is what I'll be looking at today though. These games being the Old Republic, so KOTOR 1, KOTOR 2, and the conceptual third, as well as the Old Republic MMO and possible the KOTOR remake in the pipeline. Knights of the Old Republic was released by BioWare and was published by LucasArts in 2003, the game becoming an overnight classic due to its connection with the Star Wars franchise, which was just off the back of Attack of the Clones. The story itself was set 4,000 years before The Phantom Menace. The game was released with the story of the Republic just coming off being completely destroyed by the Sith Empire, Darth Malak, following Mandalorian Wars, after the Jedi Civil War. That's a lot of words I know, but I'll break them down for you, don't worry. The Mandalorian Wars were basically a war fought between the Republic and the Mandalorian Raiders, who were basically space Spartans. They simply lived to fight war. Now the war ravaged the Republic and the Jedi were hesitant to join. However, Revan and Malak, his friend and later apprentice, joined the war, bringing the Jedi with them. Although the Order did not condone their actions, many believed this to be necessary, and the Jedi who did enter the war were able to win it decisively, with Mandalore, the leader of the Mandalorians, being slain by Revan. Basically, that caused the end of the war. Following the war, those who had fought in order to kind of return did so, all except Revan and Malak, who disappeared into the unknown regions. However, once they returned with the Sith Armada and destroyed much of the Republic and the Jedi Order. Revan, however, is killed or captured, as we find out later, by Bastila at the peak of the assault, and Malak assumes command. This then leads to the events of the game. You, the mysterious lead, must go through trials on many planets and basically try to get pieces to form the star map. So you visit areas such as Tatooine and Kashyyyk and Dantooine, as well as new areas like Rakata Prime and Manaan. These worlds kind of are really interesting, I think. They help to build it, it being the kind of franchise. So with the older worlds like, Tatooine that we're already aware of, there is more development. With Manaan, however, there is an entirely new concept brought to the game. One with a kind of economy based around a healing property known as Kolto, which is required by both the Republic and the Empire, so both sides kind of have an uneasy truce on the planet, otherwise they simply wouldn't get what they need. Now both sides also try and undermine each other here, so there's a lot of espionage, both try to pull tricks on each other to try and get the other one basically removed from the planet, so they have the exclusive purchasing rights to the Kolto, and therefore they're able to treat their wounded more effectively. Now, moving on from the story itself, let's focus more on the game. I think the combat style is quite interesting. So it works off the D20 style, which is based upon Dungeons & Dragons. Basically, it's like a roll of a metaphorical dice in this one, so you can hit anywhere between 1 and 20. It's also turn-based, so it's obviously a very basic combat style, however I think it really works. It's quite easy. It's also, quite simple to understand as well. It's just good for casuals, to be honest, and, frankly, I like that. It doesn't necessarily rely on strategy either. It's kind of just, go in there. It's not Dark Souls, There you go, you win. Now, KOTOR also sees you running around with a bunch of other characters. These are obviously operated either by yourself or by the computer, depending on if you're choosing to play as them. So you run into, a Twi'lek, a Wookiee, Jedi Knights, a few of them. And you form an effective resistance against a whole Sith incursion that's wiped out pretty much the entire Republic and Jedi Order, which is, pretty decent. The game itself is also really impressive for its era. The game does kind of lack guidance on where to go, and progress can be difficult, but on the whole it's a really good game for the time it was released. The choice to talk to your companions or skip through that part of the narrative is also cool. It gives you an option to work out who you're traveling with, or not, depending on if you want to or if you care. Thing is as well, most of the stuff is not forced you on this game. The game itself is nice and the story on the whole is pretty polished, and it's pretty fun and very memorable. The soundtrack as well is superb. Many of the tracks they could have just reused from, the Star Wars films, not actually being used as much, with BioWare instead getting Jeremy Soule in the studio, which resulted in an award-winning creation, and many of the tracks are genuinely really good. It has to be considered one of the greatest story games released this date, and is heavily critically acclaimed. By 2007, the game had sold 3.2 million copies, with the sales in the US being estimated around 15 million. The game itself proved that there was a hunger for this kind of content, and quickly gained a cult following. You know, people started cosplaying or just generally being interested in Rev and Bastler and their crew. And after the huge popularity of the first game, BioWare decided to create a second game, suggesting to LucasArts that actually Obsidian Entertainment should be the developers. From the sequel, Knights of the Old Republic Sith Lords was born, and it was released just 1 year later. The game itself was pretty good. I believe it's, you know, in complete restoration form, with mods and whatnot, it's actually better than the first. Combat is identical to the former, you know, with D20 still being used, which pleased many people, including myself. The game, however, did have some new content. You know, it did include the same minigames, you know, Pazak, which is just a card game basically. Pretty much blackjack, except you get cards that you can add and then subtract, and you're aiming to get to 20 even, not 90, Christ. And also Swoop Racing, which is kind of like just one of those, you know, browser games you used to play when you were like probably 10. Do people even play browser games anymore? I don't know. But anyway, these side options are actually really fun, and I've spent multiple hours just playing them rather than the actual game, because they're that good. The game also continues to have kind of a big impetus on light and dark side points which dictate how your story ends, just like the original. The game itself takes place a few years after the first game, with the Jedi Republic again rebuilding after the war. However, the Sith threats have not been annihilated, and two Sith Lords known as Darth Nihilus and Darth Sion are both terrorizing the galaxy at this point. Both are accumulating kind of trauma from Mandalorian Wars. You know, Sion is the embodiment of pain and suffering, and Nihilus is, well, I guess the embodiment of a human who chooses to lose their humanity, instead kind of reverting to just empty presence, which is completely void of life, with the desire to consume everything in the universe to quench his undying hunger that will go unappeased. Both are very different enemies, with Sion often chasing the main protagonist around the galaxy in order to kill her. The main protagonist here being Mitra Surik. She's a survivor of the Mandalorian Wars and was a general in it, who, like Revan, returned to the Jedi Order after the war. However, when she returned to the war, she faced many pretty large consequences. She returns without a connection to the Force. You see, during the final battle of the Mandalorian Wars on Malachor 5, Mitra essentially causes a super weapon to detonate. This kills pretty much all the Mandalorians, but also a lot of Jedi and Republic troops too. The death toll is unimaginable. However, in an act of survival instinct, Mitra basically cuts herself off the Force and lives. So on return from the war, she goes to the Jedi Council and basically gets exiled, which is why the characters in the game refer to her as the Exile rather than by her name. Once again, you must travel, across the galaxy, but you go mainly to points that are touched by trauma of the Mandalorian Wars, which essentially you're trying to revert them back to how they were before, or at least leave a positive impact on them, acting as a sort of kind of undoing of the evil that she has done in the first place. See, the game actually features a plethora of really interesting characters. I'd say, probably more so than the first game, and I'd say probably the most interesting one is Traya, one of the most pivotal companions to the narrative. See, Traya is often overlooked as a character. I mean, bar Mitra, she is without a doubt the most important character in the story. Her character shapes the themes that are explored in the game, and she pretty simply allows the game to be more digestible. Without her explanation, it would make a lot less sense. Traya ultimately leaves you after finishing the game, kind of questioning what she actually is. She seems to be riddled with contradiction, and yet is probably the most consistent character in the narrative when it comes to behavior and kind of general actions. She's not necessarily, virtuous, but at the same time, she does fall to vices. The consistency in her view, however, and her ideals and experience kind of just smacks of Aristotelian convention, with a kind of deontological tint. And I think it's a really nice thing, for the character. So you don't see this much in media. The fact is, the game, achieves more than I think a TV show would. it kind of allows for more development in the character that you wouldn't normally see. You know, the rash, sensitive, yet loyal Atom Rand, you know, would not be as well developed in a TV show, I don't think. You know, the wide-eyed idealist Mikau, you know, wouldn't be able to add the narrative in the same way in a show, I don't think. KOTOR 2 remains one of my favourite games of all time, and possibly my favourite story game ever. The depth of character, ease at which it takes to play, interesting lore, it's pretty much everything I look for in a game. The only downside, like the first game, is you don't necessarily know what goals to reach, and you might end up missing like certain cutscenes or kind of moves that you didn't know were necessary. For example, on my first playthrough, I was basically doing like a light side playthrough. I didn't realise I had to reactivate HK-47, and ended up getting a dark side ending just because I hadn't done that, which is just a bit annoying. To add to this game is also filled with Easter eggs, which I think are pretty cool. The game, despite not including Revan, ends up, you know, showing the exile at the end, heading off to find him. And this leads us to KOTOR 3. Oh wait. So, the game was apparently, according to some, being worked on. However, you'd be following Mitra and Revan as a different third character. And you would hunt down Sith Lords. These enemies would be infinitely more powerful than those that you had even faced before, you know, Nihilus, heck, even Freya. They make them look like, you know, thick insects. This is according to the book Rogue Leaders, the story of LucasArts. These Sith Lords would have had empires of their own, controlling large swathes of the unknown regions. So apparently it was shut down due to the fact that the new president of VP Marketing and Distribution at LucasArts, Jim Ward, saw the fact that the company's profits were being made externally, from like externally developed titles. And as a result, he shut down KOTOR 3 due to the fact that it didn't meet the company's long-term vision. And then, you know, when Ward leaves in 2008, a new game starts being developed. An MMORPG. A game that will go down as iconic, with its first trailer being dropped on the 12th of July 2009. The trailer shook the internet. Some thought it was a new film, some thought it was fan-made and rubbish, but when it was revealed to be a game, in the Old Republic era, social media went crazy. The quality of the trailers, which had an insanely high production value, made people incredibly excited for the game. Star Wars The Old Republic was released in December 2011, and was immediately hyped up to be one of the games of the year. The game itself was set 300 years after the events of KOTOR 2. In between this era, Revan and Malak and all that good stuff was seen, and was, you know, quite excited. In this, you see in the cinematic trailer that the Empire retakes Korriban, the ancient home of the Sith Lord. The Sith kind of come back and they're all over the business. The Sith Empire then invade the Republic and cause a galaxy-wide war in which the Empire basically decimates the Republic. The climax of the fighting happens on the Republic capital of Coruscant, where the Jedi Temple is completely raided. You know, think Order 66, but a few thousand years earlier. The Sith and their Mandalorian allies destroy the Jedi Temple, and the Order is scattered, in what would later be known as the sacking of Coruscant. This we see in the Jedi Order kind of returns Tython under the new Grand Master Satele Shan, granddaughter of KOTOR's Bastila Shan and wife of Revan. Shan essentially assembles the new Jedi Order, and this is where KOTOR begins. So you have the option to play as a Jedi, Sith, Bounty Hunter, Republic Special Forces, Imperial Intelligence, or a Smuggler. And there's 8 of these storylines. The storylines, in my opinion, are some of the best content the game has to offer, with each of them being interlinked with others in some kind of way. For example, one of the characters, Risha, references one of the other characters, Vet, and how they used to know each other at one point being friends, wondering where she is. She's in fact travelling, you know, the galaxy with one of the other playable characters at this point. And it's just a cool little, you know, thing that I just think is pretty nice about the game, you know, just these small Easter eggs. References back to the original KOTOR, and they're few and far between. Bastila Shan does appear in a holocron at one point. You do get to visit Taris, the planet that Malak destroys in the first KOTOR game after the devastation. T7, one of the most important companions of the game, is obviously an homage to T3M4. Revan's astromech droid in the first game. It is, however, different enough from the other games. And it's kind of, you know, surrounding more so an all-out war rather than the kind of, you know, running about the galaxy, kind of just doing side quests of the first two games. The most important character for both sides, I would argue, is probably Imperial Intelligence Officer and the Jedi Knight. The Jedi Knight, I believe, was meant to be the main character of the game. However, due to the fact that there are no main characters, it is debatable. It certainly is the most enjoyable one for me personally. If you've more of a hardcore fan, I definitely recommend it. But I'd also recommend the Revan novel first. Again, if you're a hardcore fan, it just makes everything make more sense. It somewhat links kind of the 300 years between the two, which is why I recommend reading it, to be honest. If you have the hot time, I'd 100% recommend playing through all the stories. It took me about 2 years to do, but it's fun, and I'd say on the whole it's worth it. I mean, the game itself features a similar score to KOTOR games, with many of the pieces being reused, or they are not kind of notable tracks. And, you know, they do reuse some of the originals, for sure. Many of these kind of set the scene for a very memorable game, even if the game is a bit kind of goofy at times due to the fact that it is an early 2010s game. The animation can somewhat wrong, and the dialogue is straight up ludicrous at times. The combat system is different though, it's not D20. It's no longer turn-based, it's basically just spam. So it does still use the number keys, which, honestly, are right. The game isn't too difficult either. I mean, it is an MMO, and unlike the other two, you know, it is multiplayer, as by definition. This does bring in, you know, fun things. It brings in the GTN, or the Galactic Trade Network as it's known, which allows you to buy and sell items. You know, think Habbo Hotel. Actually, to be fair, that's probably, yeah, anyway, you can just buy and sell stuff. There's also flashpoints, which are the game's equivalent of dungeons in other MMOs, as well as PvP, which are all fun. Arguably, the best part is operations. You can play this with other players or guilds, and honestly, I think it's really good. You can meet some really cool people through this, and you know, you can just play the game with more other games, to be fair. I think Discord has massively helped with this as well, with there being kind of an encouragement to participate in events through it. To be fair, none of my friends like properly like Star Wars, so playing them on, so I just play with Discord guilds, which is quite fun, you know? You meet some cool people, and on the whole, it's a pretty damn good time. I'd recommend it if you've played a lot of single player. It adds another kind of layer to the game that wasn't already there. The game has a lot of potential, and one such harnessing of the potential was arguably one of the best expansions ever in, well, maybe any game, to be fair. It's a bold statement, I know, but Knights of the Fallen Empire completely switches up the game. The trailers are probably some of the most famous of all time for a video game. This takes place after all the class stories are wrapped up and come to their conclusions, with the galaxy being in some form of peace due to the end of the war and its implications. I won't spoil it, don't worry. Following some of the events of Shadow of Revan as well, you launch into Knights of the Fallen Empire. So, basically what it comes down to is a Shadow Emperor known as Valkorion is in charge of Sakul, a planet in the Unknown Regions. Basically, they just completely take over the galaxy in like 5 years, and it's your job to overthrow them. So most of the Empire is made up of droids, so they're kind of self-sustaining as well, so you know, they get battered, but then they just make themselves back up again, or they're also very easy to produce. There's an entire planet made for producing them. It's pretty nuts. It is interesting though, because I was thinking about this the other day. It is your job to destroy the Empire, and it's essentially you're putting back the galaxy to how it was before. But while you're doing this, you know, you're basically infighting, and you're trying to then basically win the war so you can continue infighting with your two factions. And it's just a bit strange. I mean, you know, sure, the Infinite Empire might be tyrannical, but there's no war, at least during it, before you start getting involved. Its only kind of interest is retaining planets. And, you know, they do uphold laws there. The expansion itself does visit a lot of worlds, and a lot of new characters, many returning characters, as well as new ones. The story is quite long. Cinematically, it is a big step up from the base game, with characters like Valkorion, Thekan, and Senya all having new faces. It looks so much more modern, rather than the kind of slightly cartoonish style of the regular game. This has only gone on to improve, with Sith Onslaught adding new faces for Tawana, and others, of course. Content is good, however. There is some kind of sort of lack of content as well, though, when it comes to the frequency of the releases, with it being about 1 or 2 hours of content every few months. Bearing in mind the game has generated $1 billion since launch, and increasing content would surely see an increase of traffic towards the game. The newest SOTOR trailer has 9 million views on all platforms, which does show that there is some genuine interest in the game, or at least to a degree. The continued updates and support from both BioWare, EA and LucasArts show there is definitely something going on there to at least keep it alive. But why keep it alive when you could have a fully functioning game with constant updates, not only just adding story, but also multiplayer content? That would be so cool, man. The 7.2 update is just dropped, and honestly, it was pretty damn good. New story, a new planet to explore, a revamped PvP style, some even new maps. However, not to complain, it could be better. And I don't think that's unreasonable to suggest. Sure, 7.2 was fantastic, but that's the only major update we've had in a few years. If SOTOR did release something on the scale of Knights of the Fallen Empire again, it would ruin the internet. I mean, in the best possible way as well. I do feel the game will kind of be dead, bar the hardcore fans like myself who still play it. And I only play it for completionism at this point. The truth is, the game stays alive due to new players who are drawn into it. And once they're either bored or done with what they've done, they just leave. I mean, I asked 25 people who have already played this game, and some of them even quit before finishing their first class story. But those who did complete their first class story proceeded to quit at a later date, getting kind of fed up with the game. With only 8 of the 25 actually playing until the most recent update, and then basically leaving until the next content was released. And honestly, I can't blame them. The game is very fun in my opinion, however it does rely heavily on the fact that I am a fan of the franchise, and at the period of the time that this game is set in. I mean, the game itself is a huge success, however it does have shortcomings. On the whole, it is one of my favourite games of the 2010s, and it is very entertaining, with a high kind of ceiling for potential when played well. The game has its problems, and sure, there is huge potential, which does need to be worked towards. But we will get there eventually, and even if nothing does change, and there's just the slow and steady updates every now and then, you know what? I'll take it. Now we move on to the KOTOR remake. There was a trailer released in 2021. It was announced by Sony Interactive Entertainment in collaboration with Aspyr. The game will apparently take parts of both the first game and the second, with the remake hopefully, being good. There will also likely be some form of reference to modern Star Wars, with Revan and the whole kind of Old Republic era no longer being considered canon by Disney. Very little factual information is available about the game, however. Bloomberg has, however, released since the game has been put on hold indefinitely due to Aspyr firing the art director and the design director for some reason. The game probably won't be out until 2025, and Aspyr now has been kicked out completely of the project, instead being replaced by Saber Interactive. So, that's all good. So yeah, that pretty much comes to the end. It was a bit of an incoherent essay, I'm sorry. My ability to read is a bit shit. But yeah, I'll see you in the edit. Alright, bye bye.